Hey dudes, and welcome back to my basement. You know what I love? Shakespeare. But you know what sucks about Shakespeare? It's that it takes place in the old times, and the olden days, and we can't be having any more of that 16th century nonsense in today's year of 2022. No sirree. We gotta keep it cool and fresh. So that's why I'm taking a look at two of the hottest Shakespeare adaptations in town. That's right. I'm talking about Romeo and Juliet, 1996, and Hamlet, 2000. So sit back and relax as we take a look at the coolest Shakespeare adaptations to ever exist.
So, you're at an impasse. You really, really want to watch a Romeo and Juliet film adaptation. However, you certainly don't want to watch a movie that takes place in the 13th century. But at the same time, you really want to listen to the original Elizabethan English dialogue. Well, you're in luck, buddy, because I have just the film for you. Baz Luhrmann's 1996 film, Romeo plus Juliet. It's got all the confusing dialogue of the original play,
the exchange of thy love's faithful vow for mine,
with a cool new 1990s aesthetic. What more could you really want in a film? I don't know. You know what I also don't know? I don't know why people like this movie.
Sure, it is pretty good acting from all of the actors. I'm not denying that. I mean, it has Leonardo DiCaprio in it, for goodness sake, in his pre-Titanic days, albeit. And it has like a really fun and in-your-face 90s aesthetic that would work for it. And that's not my problem with it. The problem is what they do with that 90s aesthetic. I think inherently it's okay, it's fine, it should be acceptable, it should be allowed that Shakespearean stories be told in the modern day. I think that can be a very great thing, and I feel like you can use the modern day to retell Shakespearean stories in a fun and new, interesting way, and that's been done millions of times before. Look at like West Side Story, people love that movie, but this is different because it keeps the dialogue from the original. It stays as accurate to the original story as it can. In this movie, it does not work because the original story, staying true to that story, a lot of elements from that original story do not work in the 90s. They do not work in this new setting. And sure, I can suspend my disbelief, I guess, but like, then what's the point of the 90s aesthetic? Just to be a fun 90s aesthetic. And if it's just there to be there, then does the movie have any real purpose or value to it at all? No, it doesn't. There's no real reason to watch this movie over any other Romeo and Juliet adaptation. The characters still act like they live in the 1500s, and you could plop this entire story into the 1500s, just change the setting around them, and nothing would change. Don't change any of the dialogue, don't really change the way the characters act at all, and the story would remain the same. There'd be nothing that would be confusing. It would work perfectly fine, because nothing was changed from the original story to this story, or at least nothing that actually tried to adapt it to fit a new setting. That's not something that this movie cared about at all. This movie only exists to look really cool and impressive. Like, whoa, they made a Romeo and Juliet movie in the 90s. Cool. But like, this movie isn't cool. It's not impressive. It's lame. It stinks. And it's not very good.
In all fairness, Buzz wasn't really trying to make high art. He wanted to make something that would have mass appeal. After all, Shakespeare himself was writing his plays to appeal to the low class. Despite how we view them today, these plays were never meant to be taken as artistic masterworks. Even with this in mind, the 1996 film adaptation of Romeo and Juliet still leaves something to be desired. Audiences certainly did not agree with me though, because this film was very successful at the box office and was also pretty well liked by critics.
The success of this film did not go unnoticed by other filmmakers and studios. Going into the new millennium, there were a barrage of similar films, stories that were written by Shakespeare and then adapted and changed to the modern setting, or moved into a new modern setting. I mean, this wasn't the first time this happened before. Like I said before, West Side Story is a prime example of this happening before in the 60s, but there was a big boom of these things in the early 2000s and the late 90s. But a lot of them were changed and adapted to fit their settings. Their titles were often changed, and if you didn't know it, you wouldn't know that this was a Shakespearean adaptation, which is how I think modern-day Shakespearean adaptations should be done. But there is one other movie, one film in particular, that takes the Romeo plus Juliet approach. Takes an original Shakespearean story and plops it into a modern day setting without adapting or changing or adjusting much at all.
The film I'm referring to is Hamlet. Now, this specific iteration of Hamlet was released in the year 2000, only 4 years after Romeo and Juliet. This movie was directed by Michael Almereda and stars Ethan Hawke. Like Romeo plus Juliet, this film takes place in modern day. It remains extremely faithful to the play and maintains all of the original dialogue. Criticism toward this film was much more divided, however, compared to the criticism that Romeo and Juliet got upon its release.
Despite not being as well received by audiences and critics, I think Hamlet is at least a much more enjoyable experience than Romeo and Juliet, because I think on its own merit, just inherently, Hamlet, the story, fits better in a modern environment. It fits better in this environment of New York City. And they changed enough to actually make it make sense. That's something that makes this film work a lot better than Romeo and Juliet does, because although it does take a similar approach by remaining extremely faithful and keeping all the same dialogue, I can see a reason why someone would want to tell a story about Hamlet, the same story about revenge, in the modern day setting. But the movie isn't perfect. It partially wants to be a serious film outside of Shakespeare. It wants you to take it seriously. Like, this is an actual revenge thriller. This is a literal revenge thriller. It exists on its own merit outside of Shakespeare. But at the same time, it really doesn't. Because while maintaining the same dialogue, the movie kind of still feels a little gimmicky. Not as gimmicky as Romeo and Juliet, mind you, but still a little gimmicky. Because it doesn't really add anything to the story. You could adapt this dialogue, keep it basically the same, with the same meaning, but adapt it to be modern English, and the story would just be a modern day revenge thriller that is based on Shakespeare, sure, but it exists entirely on its own merit. Also, as the movie goes on, I feel like the acting gets more melodramatic and kind of silly. You can tell the performers are really giving it their all. It feels like they're overperforming. It feels like they don't know how to perform with this dialogue, which I understand. Romeo and Juliet doesn't shy away from its inherently absurd nature because it knows what it is. It knows it's an absurd movie, it knows it's a dumb movie, and it knows it's a movie that makes no sense. But the movie still kind of falls flat for me because it doesn't have a real purpose. This movie doesn't fall as flat for me. It's more interesting, and I actually liked watching it. I enjoyed watching it, but it feels like it doesn't know what it is. It doesn't know what it wants to be. It wants to be serious, but it also wants to be a gimmick movie. And I feel like if this came out at any other time, other than the 2000s, other than this weird period of modern Shakespearean adaptations, it probably wouldn't have gone for this approach, and it probably would have made a lot more sense and have been a much stronger, better movie. But in the state it is now, it just really doesn't work. I think that we should be able to take older works and adapt them to fit the story that we want to tell. I think that's great, but it just doesn't work with these movies because they try to maintain too much of the original source material while still trying to do something new, which doesn't make any sense. And that's why these movies are so infuriating sometimes. But thankfully, these types of Shakespeare adaptations died in the 2000s, and they will forever stay there. With that, I leave you. So, thank you for watching. See you next time.